Trebaruna, Senhora do mistério e do encanto, do conhecimento oculto da vida. Vem abençoar as nossas terras, Ophiussa, a grande deusa serpente. Tecendo os sentidos, as vertentes, as trilhas e os caminhos do remembramento, que através de ti, Trebaruna, a ressonância das forças telúricas e os segredos das tectónicas trevas são o teu fogo ecoando na noite eterna. Vem abençoar as nossas terras, Trebaruna, Senhora do lar e do destino, a mãe velada no manto da morte e da guerra, e da magia e do feitiço. No cantar das mulheres à beira-rio, relembra-te, sob a chama branca do luar ardente, por cada brecha de luz adentram as palavras, os sussurros, o canto e o encanto dos contos cantados por nós, aqueles que mantêm vivas as memórias. Relembrar, recordar, despertar. Trebaruna, saudade daquilo que não conhecemos, mas que habita em todos nós, desde tempos imemoriais.
Hello my dear friends, how is it going? I'm Mari Theriger and today I'm going to continue with my Iberian paganism series. This time sharing with you information concerning the Celto-Iberian and Lusitanian goddess Trebaruna, goddess of the home, community, of death and war, and goddess of magic and mysteries. As with practically all pre-Roman cultures, the knowledge that was left to us, what survived, regarding the indigenous gods of such European peoples was mainly because the Romans left some epigraphs of the gods of the peoples they eventually conquered. Many of these gods ended up being incorporated into classical cults and pantheons, or suffered religious syncretism, either giving rise to deities with characteristics of several gods or attributes of deities merged with existing gods. There was also the phenomenon of changing the names of native deities, giving them names of other classical gods, or Romanizing the existing names for a better understanding on the part of the Romans, of course, in understanding the powers and characteristics of the deity. An example of this is the Lusitanian god Ares Lusitani, whose original name we don't know, but taking into consideration how such a deity was called by the Romans, we understand that it must have been a Lusitanian god of war, or at least with characteristics the Romans associated with the Hellenic god of war, although we also know that he was the god of horses and riders in Lusitanian mythology, to whom the Romans have also worshipped and sacrificed to, and remained a very active deity even after the Romanization of the Iberian peoples. However, the goddess that we are going to explore today, in a way her name was not Romanized to a great extent and remained practically the same, Trebaruna, which may be an indication of her great importance and power and influence, as well as the great political and military power of the peoples who worshipped her. And as such, even though she was yet another goddess that the Romans in Iberia also adopted and worshipped, her name has not changed much, so she must have been a very powerful goddess, and due to her attributes linked to magic, the occult, and the mystical, perhaps it was a matter of respect and even fear and superstition that led to respecting her ancestral antiquity, her character also, and even her personality. As has been said, Trebaruna is a Lusitanian deity that we have knowledge about thanks to mainly Roman epigraphy. Some sources that I have consulted say that she was also a goddess of the Vettone, since at least two of the inscriptions or the epigraphs in which her name appears, it appears precisely in Vettone territory, or at least the geographical area understood to have been Vettone territory. But we shall see that further ahead. Bearing in mind that she seems to have been a very important deity, it will not be strange or even difficult to understand why she was a goddess worshipped by other peoples and tribes and communities other than the Lusitanians or the Lusitanian people. However, given the difficulty of establishing with certainty the pre-Roman borders between the different Celtiberian and Iberian indigenous peoples, it is still considered that Trebaruna was a Lusitanian goddess, as it is in this area that most traces of her cult appear in the great majority of the votive epigraphs in her honor as well. So, let us delve into our today's main subject. Let's know a little bit more about Trebaruna. I do hope you enjoy this video, and let's get started, my dear friends, please. Let's start with the meaning of the name Trebaruna. The most accepted theory about the meaning of the name Trebaruna comes from the junction of the Celtic base word treb or trebo, meaning house, community, tribe, and with the Indo-European word runa or runas, therefore meaning secret or mystery, being the word that would later on give rise to the word rune to designate a magical character used as an element in a written form. I've already made a video about the origin of the word rune and its meaning, so I advise you to watch this video for a better understanding in this information icon at this right upper corner, if you can see it. Well, since this is the most common theory, Trebaruna's name therefore means something like house of secrets or house or home of mysteries or even community or tribe of secrets or mysteries or temple of mysteries, although it seems that this goddess was really linked to a cultic space, not only domestic, but also a temple or sacred space linked to the mysteries of the occult and magic and traditional magic, of course. And this cultic space related to magic and occultic mysteries is important to take in mind, because we know the great majority of pre-Roman sacred spaces and spaces of worship in ancient Iberia were in the natural landscape, especially in prominent landscape features and sources of water as well. So Trebaruna could be a goddess whose temple was in natural spaces. Although I should say that with the progressive Romanization of the Iberian Peninsula, we start to see different ways of writing the name of Trebaruna. The earliest native forms, especially in the pre-Roman native Lusitanian language, the name Trebaruna still retains the idea of mystery and secrets. Runa, and rune, right? Further ahead, I shall show you an interesting example of an inscription in a place where animals were sacrificed to several Lusitanian deities, and the name of Trebaruna is in there. And it is a curious archaeological site dating to the 5th century before the Common Era, where we can see an early contact with Romans, because the inscription is written in the Lusitanian language but starts to use a script similar to the Latin script, Proto-Latin script or written form. In fact, to be more precise, written in a language or characters of a language that is on the threshold of Latin in a period of the Iron Age, still very early for the Iberian Romanization. But in this language, it still retains much of the vocabulary of the Lusitanian language. I should point out that the original Lusitanian language is not of Celtic origin, but it is Indo-European, and the vast majority of evidences for that language appears written using a more archaic form of the Latin script due to the contact with the Romans in periods prior to the beginning of Romanization. However, the original Lusitanian is an Indo-European Iberian language with many words of Celtic origin, surely, but not a fully Celtic language, unlike other languages of the Iberian Peninsula from the same period of the Iron Age, especially languages further north of the Iberian territory, especially along the Atlantic and Atlantic West. Be that as it may, as Romanization progressively spreads across the Iberian Peninsula, we began to see other ways of writing the name of Trebaruna, forms that are more Romanized but still retaining the original essence of the Lusitanian language. As said before, the inscriptions that speak of a goddess named Trebaruna either comes from an earlier period of the Iberian Iron Age in contexts where we already notice some contact with Latin script or Proto-Latin script, but using the Lusitanian native language, or, of course, in later periods during and post-Romanization by both Romanized natives or by Romans. But due to the Celtic and non-Celtic Indo-European etymological analysis, we understand Trebaruna to be a far older deity than the Iron Age inscriptions and Roman votive epigraphs. In fact, in an example I will show you further ahead, 5th century before the Common Era, her name appears on an inscription on a place where we notice, archaeologically speaking of course, a continuous cultic animal sacrifice to deities before the inscription was created. And the inscription itself is the written evidence of those ancestral local cultic behaviors. But returning to natural places for the cult of Trebaruna and in relation to water, and later forms of writing the name, it's important to point out that other authors and researchers interpret runa as river, run, or stream, run. So the name would mean fountain of the village or tribe, or that which lives or lies or within the fountain. So a more animistic approach here to a goddess whose realm is beyond or below a body of water. This other theory can be supported by the fact that one of the inscriptions appears next to a stream, which is also a good proposal since many Iberian deities, especially from the Iberian West, are often related to water as a religious element of sacrifices, but also as a barrier between worlds and initiation cults related to the ancestral knowledge of the underworld. Even today, especially in Portuguese mythology and folklore, there are still many feminine beings linked to both magic and witchcraft as well as water, and they turn out to be more than 3,000 different deities related to local waters, whether springs, rivers, lakes or streams. And this is only in the territory which comprises the modern country of Portugal, not even mentioning Spain. The Iberian Peninsula has over 5,000 deities in the periods between the Neolithic and the Iron Age alone, so there's plenty to choose from. But indeed, there's this very recurrent theme of enchanted women inhabiting rivers and streams. Almost every river, stream and spring in the Iberian Peninsula is named after a pre-Roman or pre-Christian deity. It has also been suggested, or rather proposed, the etymological root of Aron, meaning the one who protects, but that's something that needs further study. And there's also the possibility that the first part of this goddess name comes equally from Trebar, which means wise, giving an understanding that Trebaruna is the wise goddess of mysteries or secrets, or the wise lady of the water, or the wise lady of the tribe or the settlement. But I think we can at least say that Trebaruna is therefore a goddess mostly of the domestic environment, the private life, the protector of the home and the family and the household, which further indicates her connection with traditional folk magic of the private life, the domestic environment, as she seems to be tied to the idea of secrets or mysteries. So perhaps we could say there's a certain connection here with the weaving of fate, presiding over the destiny of families and communities. Hence, in her epigraphs, the votive offerings and invocations allude to the idea that when destiny goes well, due to the promises and the rites and sacrifices done to Trebaruna in her honor, she gives her favor, and as such, things go well for the person who has sacrificed to her. Therefore, the person has to keep the promises and raise a votive stone in her honor to give thanks and the promised paid and the bargain sealed. Starting from the most accepted meaning for this goddess name, Trebaruna would be a goddess of the home, whose powers would extend to the tribe, to the community, thus becoming a protector of the group beyond the family nucleus. Perhaps this is a factor that led this goddess to retain her name and her cult to this day, precisely because of her popularity. We see this with other gods, of course, such as the god Thor, from Scandinavian mythology, from the Iron Age and early Middle Ages, as he was, or still is, one of the most popular deities in Scandinavia, and quite worshipped down to a domestic level even. Or perhaps a better example is Loki. Despite not being a god, Loki was quite popular until recent folklore as a domestic spirit, especially linked to heat and weather and helping farmers with soil fertility and harvesting and the growth of vegetation, also as the spirit of the hearth. So Loki's popularity was such that he eventually became a cultural hero and the semi-shamanic figure present in almost all surviving Scandinavian myths. So perhaps it is the same situation with the goddess Trebaruna, a goddess whose importance in the domestic world made her very popular as a goddess of the community, family, home. Hence, it was more difficult to fully Romanize this deity. But there was some Romanization nonetheless, due to her connection to the Roman goddess Victoria, and because some of her inscriptions were made by soldiers, it is believed that Trebaruna could have had warrior attributes linked to death and war. And by now you are probably starting to think about Odin as the Germanic god also connected to war, battle carnage, and death in the battlefield, and later on having been connected to the runes. And here Trebaruna also has those associations, and her name itself is connected to the very term runa, rune, from which it derives the word rune. And since she is a much older goddess, perhaps we are in the presence of Odin's and Freya's great-grandmother, or something like that. Just kidding. Well, moving on. I should also point out that there is an important inscription to several Lusitanian divinities, as said before, in the archaeological site of Cabeço das Fráguas, or just Cabeço das Fráguas, in Guarda, northern Portugal. Here we see some names of Lusitanian deities, and there seems to be a link with the divinity Rev, or Reo, in the dedication of Cabeço das Fráguas, and this is a god of the heavens. For a better understanding, we can equate with the Hellenic god Zeus or the Roman Jupiter. In fact, we have the same etymological roots here of several deities of the sky with a sovereign character. And since Trebaruna is here included in this inscription dating from the 5th century before the Common Era, Trebaruna was then undoubtedly one of the most important pre-Roman deities of the Lusitanians and other peoples of Western Iberia. Hence, some authors and researchers believe that this goddess could also have played a role of sovereignty, once again underlying her great importance to the point that her Romanization was not so abrupt and evasive. In this inscription, we have several major deities and the respective animals sacrificed to them. Therefore, Trebaruna would be a goddess of the home and the tribe that eventually evolves to a warrior and sovereignty functions, certainly due to her importance and popularity, thus extending her cult to other areas and having other attributes. This multifunctionality should not be surprising, something very common in the pre-Roman deities of the Iberian Peninsula, and of course, obviously, something very common in paganism in general. The popularity of a deity will extend its cult to other fields, thus leading certain deities to have multifunctions. But of course, it is also important to bear in mind that when a deity is popular and powerful, it will also draw the attention of other pagan peoples who will want to worship this deity as well, generating a religious and cultural syncretism and consequently extending even more the popularity and importance of this deity. Also, we have very similar parallels with other Celtic cultures or Celticized cultures. The goddess Morrigan of the Irish was a sovereign goddess, warrior and protector of the tribe, just like Trebaruna. And despite Trebaruna being possibly an older goddess than the goddess Morrigan, both are quite similar. Well, as pointed out throughout this video, Trebaruna was worshipped by the Lusitanians and quite possible by the Vettons or the Vettonians as well, which were two, let's say, neighboring peoples who spoke an ancient Indo-European pre-Celtic language in Western Iberia. At least three of the epigraphs where a name appears, are also found further north of Lusitanian territory, already by the borders with Celts and Celtiberians and Celticized peoples. I'm going to show you a map with the modern border of Portugal and Spain, just so you have a better perception, and I will indicate on the map more or less the borders of the Lusitanians and the Vettones in pre-Roman periods, but please take into consideration that these borders have greatly changed all through the Iron Age, and eventually both Lusitanians and Vettones ended up being merged together at several points, and with Romanization, Lusitania became a Roman province which ended up expanding Lusitanian territory further south, north and east, to the point that Vettonian territory was completely merged into Lusitanian territory. Also, Roman colonization in the Iberian Peninsula wasn't as successful and quick as in ancient Gaul, as it took more than 200 years for the Romans to fully Romanize the Iberian Peninsula, especially the Lusitanian territory and further north Gaelic peoples of northern Portugal and northwestern Spain, as the territories are quite mountainous. So, as you can imagine, in more than 200 years of struggle and war, many things changed, especially people's mentalities and cultures, and of course, the borders have changed quite a lot. But let's take a look at the territories in pre-Roman periods of the Iron Age, as best as it is possible to understand through archaeology. And I'll mark Lusitania in green and Vettone territory in blue, and the inscriptions where Trebaruna appears will be red dots. So we could indeed say that the great majority is within Lusitanian territory, and due to the close proximity with the Vettones, it isn't strange that she would also be known outside Lusitanian borders. In fact, since part of her name probably derives from a Celtic dialect, and taking into consideration some of her epigraphs further north, closer to Celtic and Celtiberian peoples, she was also probably known further north, but there are yet evidences, or at least more evidences of that, to be found. Only the inscription of Cabeço das Fráguas, previously spoken in Guarda, Portugal, was written in the Lusitanian language, already using a semi-Latinized or proto-Italic script, or somewhere on the threshold of an Italic written form of the 5th century before the Common Era, but the language itself, the vocabulary, is in Lusitanian. I'm not going to develop on this video about the Lusitanian language and other languages of pre-Roman Iberian Peninsula, such as Iberian and Celtiberian, but it should be noted that such languages already had a written form, very runiform in the shape of the characters. Some of these runic alphabets were already in use almost 1,000 years before the runes were introduced to Germanic peoples. So we do know these languages and how to write them, which is quite interesting, but it has to stay for other videos. But with the progressive Romanization of ancient Iberia, the Paleo-Hispanic scripts progressively adopted the Latin script, or better still, adopted the Old Italic script. As mentioned before, it is possible that the goddess Trebaruna was somewhat assimilated to the Roman goddess Victoria, which has been proposed by most researchers. An assimilation after the Romanization of the Iberian Peninsula, of course. There are two different inscriptions, one for each goddess, made by the same person, a soldier. Unfortunately, I couldn't find these inscriptions, I'm sorry, the epigraph to show you. But many of the sources speak of these inscriptions in great detail, inscriptions to the two goddesses by the same individual. However, it must be taken into account that between these two inscriptions by the same person, there is a chronological difference of 25 years between one inscription and the other, which is possible that we are just facing a change of deities and mentalities and not Trebaruna having become Victoria or assimilated into Victoria. The soldier in question, by the time he made the first votive inscription, was a newly enlisted young man into the Roman army and made an offering to the goddess of his tribe, the goddess Trebaruna. So it seems to us that in this first case we are certainly dealing with a later, actually an earlier period epigraph, and by a native soldier recruited for the Roman army. Therefore already Romanized and writing with Latin script, but still worshipping the goddess of his people, the goddess Trebaruna. 25 years later, already a veteran and a very long period of his life in contact with Roman soldiers, he dedicated a second inscription and made his offering to the goddess Victoria. And here this individual ended up undergoing the Romanization of his belief system. Therefore, there are no clear indications that can tell us whether Trebaruna was actually assimilated to the Roman goddess Victoria. This soldier may well have been a Romanized native who later changed his mind and ended up worshipping Victoria instead of Trebaruna because of his continuous contact and living among Romans. But of course, it could also have been Trebaruna ending up being assimilated with the Roman goddess Victoria, by native soldiers incorporated into the Roman army, since Trebaruna was already a goddess somewhat linked to war. So it wouldn't be strange that Trebaruna has been syncretized with Roman Victoria and later replaced by her in some areas of the Iberian Peninsula. But at least this helps us to understand the attributes of Trebaruna in relation to war and victory in battle. So, Trebaruna is a multifunction goddess, like so many feminine beings, which is outstanding, as all the deities who are quite popular, and their cults are adopted by several other cultures and peoples, and such cults prolonged through time. Primarily, she seems to have been a domestic goddess, quite popular, goddess of the home, family, protection, goddess of the community, and linked to the magical religious displays within the pre-Roman Western Iberian belief systems. There's clear indication that even though her name was somewhat altered through time, according to the change of languages and local dialects, as well as the very regional distinct pronunciations of a language, she wasn't forgotten and her popularity only increased. A goddess, without a doubt, among the most popular and powerful deities, as evidenced by an inscription previously demonstrated, where she is among the most powerful and the most worshipped and popular native deities of Western Iberia. No doubt a goddess also connected to waters and other sacred spaces where sacrifices took place, and as the Roman colonization takes place, her role as a protector goddess is extended and she becomes quite popular among Roman soldiers as well, both indigenous peoples who ended up enlisted within the Roman army, but also among non-indigenous Roman soldiers. And so her popularity among the Roman army extended her powers to war, battle, and victory, as she seems to have been a goddess who weaves the fates of the household, the family, and extended even to the destiny of the community. It seems reasonable that among soldiers as well, she also became a goddess weaver of battles and the fate of soldiers and the very fate of a battle. It isn't just the previous example I've given you about the native soldier, but Trebaruna also became one of the most important deities and even protector of the Roman city of Caparra, nowadays in modern Spain, where a dedication to Trebaruna was erected in the Forum, giving her the title of Augusta, Augustae Trebarune, which is a fact rare and notable of an indigenous deity being elevated to the highest place in the Forum of a Roman city, attributing to her the status of Augusta. Trebaruna, at least in this Roman city, even became the most important local deity, linking her to the cult of the emperor even. So even with Romanization, the indigenous traditional religious beliefs in relation to Trebaruna were kept. The very fact that, at least to my knowledge, she was the only indigenous Iberian goddess to have the title of Augustae indicates how powerful and revered she must have been to the point of becoming a goddess associated to the cult of the emperor himself. Anyway, I maintain what I've said at the end of the video in relation to the goddess Ategina, and I say it again in relation to Trebaruna. Whoever you are, you don't have to inhabit the geographical areas where Trebaruna has been honored and worshipped to this day, and you don't have to be Portuguese or Spanish or have any Iberian or Iberian Atlantic or Celtic or Gaelic ancestry even to honor and worship this goddess. If you feel drawn to this goddess, why not include her in your daily affairs and ask for her favor? I dare say the gods care little about your ancestry. Having an ancestry of this and that doesn't give you any right. It's like saying your grandfather was a great man of honor and courage and has done great deeds. That's all good and right, but your ancestors' deeds do not automatically make you a good or bad person, and we cannot simply live in the shadow of what our ancestors did, be that good or bad. We are who we are, and we too have value, and we can do great things on our own. We can choose to be whoever we want to be. I think it's safe to say the goddess, or this goddess and the gods in general, are more interested in actions, deeds, the content of your own mind, heart, and spirit, and not in on the past actions done by others, not the past mentality you don't have or the past deeds you never did. It's now that matters, what you choose to do with your life and who you decide to be. Trebaruna is yet another goddess anyone can show appreciation for if they feel drawn to her. It will only enrich the relationships you create with those other than human and other than animal persons. I hope this video was useful. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tak for ida. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Farewell, my dear friends.